Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Housing, Real Estate, and Resiliency, a webinar about meeting local workforce housing needs with a purpose. It's my pleasure to be with you all here this afternoon on this beautiful day. I'm here with a panel of esteemed speakers on the topic, and we'll introduce them in just a moment. I want to welcome you to our Zoom event. If you have any questions about the technical aspects of using chat or Q&A for questions and comments, go through that in just a bit. But I do welcome you on behalf of MSU Extension and the MSU School of Planning, Design, and Construction. I want to thank our presenters today, Dr. Noah Durst, Assistant Professor in Urban and Regional Planning Program at Michigan State University, Dr. Wayne BA, JD, MPA, and AICP, a Senior Specialist in Urban and Regional Planning at Michigan State University, also co-coordinator in the Urban Resilient Redevelopment Graduate Certificate Program. And Dr. George Berghorn, Assistant Professor in Construction Management and Research Director for Mass Timber at MSU. Welcome. Also, as myself, Harmony Gamazel, I am an educator at Michigan State University Extension on the statewide land use team. I serve mid-Michigan and southeast Michigan and community development, housing, renewable energy, sustainability, many of the hot land use topics that we are facing across Michigan. And I'd like to welcome Joseph Mcguire, coordinator of the graduate certificate program at Michigan State University that you will hear about shortly. So welcome to all of you. What we'll go over today, we have a few sections here, a lot of information to provide to you. First, I will set the stage with a few slides about affordable, attainable, and workforce housing and the concrete definitions of those. Noah will take us into land use planning and housing. George will look at the causes and impacts of structural abandonment in our communities, and Wayne will follow up with redevelopment and the climate resilient city with information about that. And Joe will give us more information about the SPDC graduate certificate program that relates to our topic today. And I have a bit of information at the end about MSU Extension's Attainable Housing program. So yes, I do invite all of you to use the chat function if you have any issues with the event. And also we have Q&A. So if you can find the Q&A button on your menu, please submit any questions to our panelists through there. So affordable, attainable, and workforce housing, the panelists, the group today, and I wanted to provide set definitions for everyone here today that we will work from throughout our time. And what does it all mean? We see these we see these terms in community development and housing, both in conversations with professionals and with residents, and we really need to get an understanding of what those three types are. So affordable housing is defined as the entire package of housing, utility, and taxes, that whole package of costs that should fall under 30% of a resident's income. If it's under that 30% of a household's annual income, as far as the percentage spent on housing, it is defined as affordable. And while 30% may seem like an arbitrary number, it actually has a history behind it. The concept comes from an understanding historically that affordability means actually spending 1 week's wages on 1 month's rent, that someone should be able to afford their rent with 1 week of their income. This approximately 25% to 30% idea was actually codified in federal housing assistance laws as early as the 1930s and expanded through the 1960s and 70s, later increased to 30% of your income, which is what we are familiar with today in policy. If the costs are higher than this, then we see portions of our population that are graduating up a scale that we call as cost burdened, severely cost burdened, or ultimately experiencing shelter poverty, where a resident is making trade-offs between paying for housing and other non-essential costs. 1 in 5 homeowners in Michigan are cost burdened, 45% of renters are cost burdened, and 20% of homeowners are living in shelter poverty in Michigan, with 45% of the renters in shelter poverty. Affordable, also, I want to round out this slide by saying affordable is also a term that is very well defined at the federal level. It is used to refer to housing programs that are available through the U.S. Housing and Urban Development Department to provide affordable housing for persons making up to 50% of the area median income. They they can use Section 8 vouchers for public housing that is affordable. Also, we have the low-income housing tax credit for residents who make up to 80% of their area median income. So a few different ways to look at affordability. Quickly, attainable, another important piece of the housing puzzle, is what we have at Extension have started to call attainable housing, something very a bit more distinct from affordable housing. While there's no set definition, the definition on this slide captures the concept very well. It's defined as non-subsidized for sale housing that's affordable to households making an income of between 80 and 120% of the area median income. And there is a lack of attainable housing that we see in Michigan and across the United States. In this graph, you can see the bottom green line are the median household incomes that we see between 1975 and 2017. So that bottom green line are the median incomes, and the top red line are the median home prices. And there is a gap between the two, thereby furthering the lack of attainable housing. And finally, my final slide, workforce housing. It means many things. Many major employers have historically provided housing to its employers. And famously in Michigan, the Ford Motor Company has built housing for its employees, as shown here in 1920. Today, workforce housing is meant to serve people of incomes that are too high for the traditional housing subsidies of affordability. So we're talking people who make 80 to 120% of your area median income. And in some instances, workforce housing is defined as a benefit or a provision for public servants required to live in their jurisdictional boundaries. So with those 3 and 4 definitions, I now turn it over to Dr. Noah Durst.
Great. Thank you, Harmony, for that nice introduction. So I'm going to talk today about land use planning and housing, some of the contemporary tools that are used and current challenges that are either posed by those specific tools or that are closely related to them. Harmony, you can go to the next one. Thank you. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with land use planning and some of the regulatory tools that are used to really enforce rules about housing development. So I'll be brief on this section and move to some more novel or interesting topics in a few minutes. So land use planning is a process of developing and implementing a comprehensive plan for the use of land in a specific community. There are a variety of different ways in which land is used, and the process of planning decides how that land is allocated and for what specific use. It is specifically, land use planning specifically aims to achieve a series of goals, preventing inefficiencies or conflicts in land use, protecting historical, cultural, or environmental assets, or promoting equity, inclusion, health, and safety. This is achieved through a variety of mechanisms. Some are public rules. These might be ordinances, regulations. Zoning, for example, is one that I'll discuss in a second. There are also private rules that govern the use of land. These might be agreements, contracts, or deed restrictions, for example. Zoning is one in particular that I'll discuss. Harmony, if you can move to the next slide for me. So zoning is one of the primary tools that we use to regulate land development, but really the use of land. And zoning, if you're not familiar with it, you can see a zoning map on the left-hand side, separates land into different zones. And those different zones are assigned different uses. Now, those uses could be residential versus commercial or industrial. They could also be different types of intensity of development. This process of zoning land arises and has arisen over the last century to address real concerns with land use conflicts. You can see on the left-hand side, this image, a neighborhood, a residential neighborhood that is unzoned. And on the right-hand side, a neighborhood that is zoned. And you can see fairly distinct differences between these two neighborhoods. On the right-hand side, you have very uniform housing type. You've got very uniform, placement of the house. You've got sidewalks and pavement and other things that are often either regulated through the subdivision regulations or the zoning ordinance. A lot of the sizing, placement, type of housing is enforced through zoning. On the left-hand side, that neighborhood is unzoned. You see a mix of housing types. There are some mobile homes or manufactured housing units that you can see, those elongated structures. You can see mixed uses. The type of neighborhood on the left that you saw in that image there is really unregulated in many respects. It's fairly common, particularly across unincorporated areas or rural areas across the country, or even on the urban fringe. Historically, we've seen a change in the way that land is zoned and used in urban areas across the country. There used to be a practice, a fairly widespread practice of stacking uses, so that residential areas might have been prioritized in some ways and protected and prevented from being exposed to perhaps industrial land. But there was also the opportunity to stack uses on top of each other in what you might think of today as a mixed use district, where you have residential and commercial on the same plot of land. Historically, across the 20th century, many jurisdictions moved away from that, separating uses entirely. We're now in a period of time over the last 20 years or so where we're really moving back to try to integrate these uses so we can have walkable, mixed use, accessible neighborhoods where you can get a variety of different types of uses in the same general vicinity to really make vibrant communities. So we're really repeating or moving back towards some of the historical approaches to regulating land. Despite the fact that we're moving, and many communities are moving toward a mixed use and an inclusive approach to zoning, there's also a widespread and long-standing effort across many local governments to exclude specific uses, either from high opportunity areas or entirely from their jurisdiction. This is often referred to with the term NIMBYism, or the not in my backyard approach to zoning. Usually often this approach zones for large lots, so single family housing exclusively, or prohibitions on multifamily housing. Strict parking requirements are also a major way in which exclusionary land use prevents the development of affordable housing, or prohibitions on mobile homes or manufactured homes, as you can see in this image. This contributes to a number of problems that I'll discuss and that many of you might be familiar with, and I'll discuss in a few minutes. The flip side is that density, or the zoning that allows for the construction of dense residential and commercial districts, really comes with a number of benefits. Higher density areas can accommodate more people and more activity, and therefore can do so at a lower price often. And high density zones may include, higher density single family. We might have row houses or smaller lots. We might also be thinking of duplexes or triplexes, perhaps possibly smaller apartments, garden apartments, or even high rises. Often these in-between types of development that aren't really skyscrapers, and they're not high-rise apartments, but they provide a mix of different types of density, can come with a number of important benefits for affordability, accessibility, walkability, and other things. Sometimes this is referred to as missing middle housing. On the right-hand side, you can see we've got mid or high-rise apartments with, possibly 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 or more units per acre, housing units per acre. On the left-hand side, we see single-family detached homes. So here we're really talking about maybe 5 housing units per acre, possibly 10. But in the middle, many cities have really failed to zone for or accommodate these missing middle types of housing that provide an in-between type of density that can provide a more affordable housing, possibly more walkable neighborhoods, without really dramatically changing the character of neighborhoods. So this is an important innovation really over the last 20 years, but it really builds on a historical approach to building neighborhoods that were dense and walkable, but still accommodating of home ownership, and a tight-knit feel in communities. Unfortunately, in many cities, particularly in high-density areas, this is very common across the West Coast, but also on some East Coast cities, when communities fail to zone for high-density housing or for missing middle housing, many times that housing is developed outside of the planning and regulatory framework. So this is an image of some of the outer single-family neighborhoods in the city of Los Angeles. And you can see fairly high density. You've got streets in the middle that go between these housing units. But on each lot, there are 2, sometimes 3, in some cases 4 structures on a single lot. Now, some of these structures are garages, but many of those garages have been converted to apartments, and many other buildings have been built on the lots in the city of LA and many of the suburban communities around it, but they've been built outside of the permitting and planning process. So these are housing units that are often not compliant with building code. They're certainly not compliant with zoning ordinances. And there's some good preliminary research just coming out over the last couple of years, looking at the national scale and indicating that, first, this type of unpermitted development is fairly common. And it's also more common in metropolitan areas where we see a very strict approach to regulating land use, particularly where we have very strict zoning ordinances. So there appears to be this counterintuitive, or perhaps intuitive, but counter-directional relationship, that the stricter that we see zoning and land use being, we often see higher levels of non-compliance. And it's unclear exactly what is driving this, but one primary hypothesis I have is that in communities that have failed to provide the necessary housing to meet workforce needs, to meet the needs of the community in terms of affordable and accessible housing, that housing is developed outside of the planning system. And it's developed to meet the changing needs of communities if the zoning and land use approach the cities are taking is not accommodating of those needs. You can go to the next one, Harmony. Thank you. There are a number of other challenges, though, besides this problem of unpermitted development that are directly related to the way that we plan for and use land, and specifically the way we zone for it. So there's some good evidence that land use regulation and zoning contributes to sprawl. If we build suburban neighborhoods that are very low density, we push development further out and further out on the urban fringe, contributing to the expansion of urban areas rather than the densification or infill. So that's one example of one challenge. Harmony, you can go to the next one, please. Another is residential segregation. Zoning has a nasty history over the last century of being used sometimes explicitly and sometimes implicitly to segregate communities or to reinforce existing patterns of segregation. This is what Rolf Pendall calls the land use regulation and the chain of exclusion, that land use controls lead to things like slower growth and the production of fewer rental housing units and therefore lower affordability, and to racial segregation, but also income segregation. There are other challenges that also are, if not driven by, that are closely related to issues of land use and zoning. One that I've looked at, for example, are spatial mismatches in housing and employment. So a few years ago here at Michigan State, I developed what's called the Michigan Spatial Mismatch Tool. It's an online website that lets you map imbalances or disparities in access to housing and employment based on where you live. So you can log onto the website and look at whether your neighborhood has a high share of employment opportunities or a high share of housing opportunities relative to the employment that is located nearby. You can also analyze disparities in race and income. This map is showing imbalances in housing and employment for the city of Detroit, or actually the Detroit region. And one of the major findings that came out of this study was that in central Detroit, downtown Detroit, we see a high concentration of employment opportunities, as you might expect. In the suburban areas to the north and northwest and northeast, you see a high concentration of housing opportunities. There's a substantial mismatch between the two. And what the map allows you to do, or this tool allows you to do, is also see which groups of residents are more disadvantaged in terms of this access to employment. If you're interested, feel free to just Google MSM tool MSU, and you'll get the first link you see will be the MSM tool. Thank you, Harmony. In a second study, this one a report for the Turner Center for Housing Innovation from UC Berkeley, I looked at the relationship between these spatial mismatches in housing and employment and land use regulation. And specifically, I looked at different types of zoning and different requirements of zoning. So whether there was strict regulation in terms of residential zoning or commercial or other types of zoning, whether there were parking restrictions, minimum lot sizes for accessory dwelling units, and another number of other requirements. And some large takeaways were that the zoning, the way that cities choose to zone, is very closely related to the imbalance or lack thereof of housing and employment opportunities. So one example I can tell you is that cities that tend to zone for low density see a high disparity between the incomes of residents and workers. In other words, cities that exclude affordable housing tend to be home to very high income residents, but tend to rely on very low income workers. So we see this disparity where exclusive cities that rely on zoning either explicitly for or that rely on zoning that serves an exclusionary purpose. We see the evidence of that in the disparity in the incomes between residents and workers in those communities. It's a very troubling finding, and it points toward the need to begin to think about the way zoning impacts, or continue to think about the way that zoning impacts accessibility and equity in our communities. There is some progress being made. Some cities like Minneapolis have decided to abolish single-family zoning and to permit other forms of housing that are higher density and provide greater walkability and greater flexibility. If you go to the next slide, Harmony, you'll see two of these examples of ways that we can modify our existing land use and zoning policies to zoning ordinances to accommodate a mix of housing types. On the left is an image of a mobile home park here in my community in the city of Lansing. Mobile homes or manufactured homes are one of, if not the most affordable housing option we have. And it's unfortunately underutilized and largely excluded from suburban communities across the country. So manufactured homes cost about half what a site-built home does. They are more affordable if sited on owner-occupied land, but still in a mobile home park like the one you see here, residents would rent their lot, typically own their home, but still, even under that land tenure arrangement, manufactured housing is much more affordable than site-built housing. It does come with some risks to tenure security, but there are ways to address that. And unfortunately, many communities have kind of taken a blind eye toward the manufactured home option and taken efforts in the zoning ordinance to exclude that use entirely, or to relegate manufactured housing to only one zone within the community. This is deeply unfortunate because we are in a pretty substantial housing affordability crisis, and it would be great to build upon the existing affordable housing options that we do have. On the right-hand side, you can see some other ways that communities can be creative about addressing the need for affordable housing solutions, but working within the land use approach that they've taken historically. So this would be through the modification or the promotion of accessory dwelling units, or ADUs. There's a variety of ways this can be done: converting garages, building or allowing extensions or additions to the property, building apartments above garages and other things. These need to be, or it's important that they are integrated into the zoning ordinance so that we don't see non-compliance of the sort that I discussed before, which poses serious and severe health and safety risks, and poses additional challenges to code enforcement and other issues if these types of modifications are done outside of the permitting process. But providing an additional source of affordable housing in smaller apartments with mixed accommodations that can really build upon and accommodate a variety of lifestyles and family sizes or household sizes and preferences regarding type of tenure and other things with a renter or a homeowner. And we really need that type of diversity in the housing stock to address the needs of communities today. Lastly, I'll just say that all of this content is covered in my course, PDC 858, which covers land use planning and housing. It's a really, really enjoyable course. Students work throughout the course on 2 different projects. One is a housing needs assessment, where they're actually collecting and analyzing data on housing needs in a specific community and learning how to write these, analyze these data and write clearly about it in a professional format. The second half of the course really focuses on the real estate development process. The enjoyable thing about this, the second part of that course, is to see students learn the depth of how challenging it is to build affordable housing given the regulatory environment today, giving students the opportunity to actually propose a development project and evaluate it financially to see if they can make it comply with the existing zoning and land use requirements, but also make it affordable for the renter or homeowner, and make it viable for the potential developer. And I find it's always an enjoyable process to see students work through those challenges, because it really is a substantial challenge that we face today. That is all I have for you. Thank you, Harmony, for advancing the slides.
Sure. Thank you, Noah. Now we invite George.
All right, I'm just going to load up my slides. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm going to talk a little bit about the causes and impacts of structural abandonment, and then just get a little bit into some tools that might be used to address this issue. And it connects with what Noah was just talking about in terms of this is often what we see on the back end when planning and zoning and decision making around housing availability don't go the way that we want it to. We often see either concentrated or dispersed areas of structural abandonment in our communities. So just to give an example, and this comes from Flint, Michigan, what this looks like in a lot of urban core areas, particularly post-industrial urban core areas. It's not just the structures, and it's not just residential structures that we're concerned with, but it's also lot vacancy. And that lot vacancy typically means that somebody has to provide some level of maintenance for those lots, even if it's just mowing, but oftentimes it's also cleanup after illegal activities have happened on those lots. So this just gives you a sense of what's going on in Flint. If we look at Detroit, a little bit larger scale issue with abandoned structures, and you can see there's been sort of a multifaceted strategy in Detroit, everything from demolition and salvage down to auction, projects that include the construction of accessory structures, and then projects that are deemed rehabbed and ready, where the Detroit Land Bank Authority obtained properties and then rehabbed them for further use. When we look at factors that contribute to where we find ourselves in so many communities around the state and really around the nation, it's a laundry list of issues. Of course, as the economy has transformed, people have moved in and out of housing and communities due to job loss. As Noah was talking about before, racial segregation is also the cause of some of this abandonment, as well as populations at a more macro scale are moving through communities. Simple population decline in communities, just change in housing preference. I tell my students, and they're often surprised to hear this, at least pre-COVID, the numbers I think have changed a little bit through COVID, but pre-COVID, the average tenure for a homeowner in a home in the United States was around 8 years. So every 8 years, people are selling and moving out of their home and moving into a new one. And that change in preferences can lead to structural abandonment and decline. Commercial preferences going away from brick and mortar stores to online stores shift our demographics around as well. Natural disasters and man-made disasters, of course, cause abandonment, and on with the reasons. The Detroit Blight Removal Task Force recognized that one of the greatest underlying issues for people leaving their homes and their neighborhoods is that when homeowners feel there is no hope for their neighborhood's future, they simply just leave. So if we dig a little bit deeper, just in a couple of these as example areas of where abandonment, where the source of abandonment of property comes from, of course, there's financial reasons, and that can be property taxes getting out of hand in an area, forcing that affordability issue in housing, maybe taking an area that was once affordable, and now when you factor in property taxes, housing costs are too high. An imbalance, and again, Noah was talking about some of this, an imbalance of renters versus homeowners, older neighborhoods where the cost of repair gets too high in homes, and again, people simply just walk away because they cannot maintain the structure. And then, of course, something that we saw significant amount of during the recession was foreclosures, and what happens when you've got concentrated areas of foreclosures in a community, and how that leads to wider spread structural abandonment. What happens is we go through these cycles of abandonment, whatever the reason is, we end up with some sort of decline, some sort of a cycle of decline that's kicked off in abandoned neighborhoods. And that cycle looks like, this: people leave, amenities start to dwindle because there's not a viable tax base to support those amenities. There's then a desire to no longer invest in that community, which leads to decreasing property value. And then if there is retail in the area, retail tends to collapse under the weight of population movement or outmigration from those areas. And the cycle, begins again or continues at a greater pace. We also know at the same time that we're looking at various man-made causes for structural abandonment. We also know that natural disasters are likely to become more frequent. The intensity of natural disasters is tending to increase as climate change is becoming more and more of a reality. And we may start to see wider spread issues of what's being termed climate refugees, people that are making large scale migration to get away from changing climatic conditions and natural disasters in various areas around the world. We also know that there is some role to be played in people moving in and then out of neighborhoods due to ecological contamination. So water contamination, contaminated air, resources that are also causing people to abandon structures and seek other places to live. Crime, of course, is another consideration for what drives people into or out of neighborhoods. And then I just want to give you a quick look of what does this really look like in practice? Because the problem is, it's not always the abandoned building that's out in the middle of nowhere by itself, but the abandoned structure often has neighbors, and there's a concern because of those neighbors.
A vacant commercial building in such bad shape it is falling apart, and it's located next to a school where small kids play.
Concerned parents are counting on our Ronnie Dahl to come to the rescue and get that dangerous building torn down.
Ronnie has more from Southwest Detroit.
This property is now up for sale, 11 acres of Blight, but buyer beware. It's in such a state of disrepair today it was condemned. The commercial building at the corner of Central and Pershing has been an eyesore in the Southwest neighborhood for years, and kids attending Phoenix Academy have had to look at it for years.
How long have they been going to school here?
About 8 years.
Yeah. And how long has this building looked like this?
About 8 years that I know of.
8 years of worrying, 8 years of concern.
It's horrible.
Yes, it is. The bricks falling, and it's just, they always tag on it, and nobody keeps up with it.
It's not good to look at because it's, it's kind of raggedy down, it's going down. So it's a good idea to probably to tear it down.
The building is unsafe. Bricks and concrete litter the sidewalk where a partial wall collapsed. Monday afternoon, a City of Detroit building inspector condemned the property. And with hours of me stopping by, this guy arrived to remove the debris.
But who owns this building?
But he didn't want to talk to me.
Who hired you?
I can't say.
You can't tell me who hired you? Why not?
I'm busy. I'm too busy. I gotta get this done.
Online records show the property is owned by Parker Place Holdings, LLC. Registered agent, Jeffrey Suskin. His number was disconnected, so I tried the real estate company helping to sell the place, Focus Realty. I'm still waiting for a return call with the owner's number.
I'm told the owner is cooperating with city officials, however.
So I think the point there again is that when we have abandonment in our communities, the structures impact more than just the parcel that they're located on. You know, in this case, you've got students attending school in the vicinity, and there's a physical health concern, but then there's also a concern of how that vacant property contributes to conditions in that neighborhood and what might be going on. I also want to just take a moment and just talk briefly about this master's thesis that was done at Morgan State University by Keisha Ransom that looked at housing abandonment and vacancy in the city of Baltimore. And the premise of the study was to look at the relationship between vacant and abandoned properties and race and economic status, again, tying back to some of what Noah was talking about, where zoning, frankly, has at times had sort of a segregationist aspect to it, whether implicitly or explicitly intended. We know that, at least anecdotally, we know that there appears to be some relationship between the presence of vacant and abandoned properties, race in terms of neighborhood composition, and then economic status of neighborhoods. So within the city of Baltimore, we know that there's been significant manufacturing and job loss in the city through the mid to late 90s, experienced over 5 decades of consecutive decades of population loss. And then just like we've seen in Detroit, Indianapolis, other cities around the country, as that happened, the population was redistributed in the city of Baltimore along race lines. So the white population in the city decreased at higher rates than the Black population did. And as the city of Baltimore's population went down, surrounding counties, particularly Montgomery County population, not only increased, but boomed. So if we look just at some neighborhoods within the city of Baltimore and start looking, this is again from that thesis work, just start looking at neighborhoods like Druid Hill, Lower Park Heights, East Baltimore, Rosemont, that have the highest percentage of Black residents of any neighborhood in the city. You'll also see with Druid Hill, Rosemont, Lower Park Heights, Waverly, that these are also neighborhoods that are among the lower median household incomes within the city. And the lowest is East Baltimore at $17,067. That was in 2000. And you'll see East Baltimore has one of the highest Black resident populations of any neighborhood within the city as well. The Baltimore study brings up an issue for planners and for people that want to respond to this. There is a question about how do we know when a property is vacant? So the city of Baltimore says it's an unoccupied structure that's unsafe or unfit for human habitation or other unauthorized use. But the US Census Bureau has a little bit different definition: habitable housing unit that does not have anyone living in it. That includes units that are for sale, for rent, awaiting people to move in, seasonal or abandoned homes. So with the Census Bureau, you have to use this classification called other vacant, because other vacant includes all of that, but says it's not actively being sold, rented, or advertised for any sort of living purpose. So sometimes it's really difficult to identify what is vacant strictly from a definition basis and how those units get defined. Again, from the Ransom study, just looking at a couple of tables here. So 2 neighborhoods with the highest percentage of housing notices. So the table on the left, East Baltimore and West Baltimore, are also majority Black at 91.4% and 84%, and had lowest median income per the 2000 census at about just under $19,000 and at $17,000 per year. So it seems that there is some correlation, at least in the city of Baltimore, and like this is kind of anecdotally what we've suspected in other locations as well. So the city of Baltimore was taking some steps to address some of this non-code compliant housing and abandoned housing throughout the city. Up through 2006, the city had demolished over 5,000 vacant structures, but many of those, if not most of those, were not redeveloped. So then you just had vacant land that was left behind and nothing was really done with that vacant land. There's some role that economic incentives play in whether a structure gets demolished or rehabbed. And those were noted in the study. Oh, and this is key to note in a place like Baltimore, where a lot of the residential housing is row housing. It's really difficult to manage that process unless you've got abandoned structures that make up the majority or the entirety of a block. It's very difficult in a row house that might be a block long to come in and just demo out individual units, because what you're left with at the end may not be structurally stable. It may not, the sum of the parts may not be equal to the whole when it was an entire integrated structure. So Baltimore has some unique challenges that relate to the construction typology as well. So then the thesis just looks at some targeted programs that have been put into place in Baltimore just to suggest where we might find some solutions. Bulk property tax sale of abandoned properties. So getting multiple abandoned properties into a single sale to make the sale process more efficient. Some blight elimination programs that target vacant properties that pose the greatest negative effects on communities, and then demolishing those to get them off the landscape. Targeted enforcement for visible outcomes. So really looking more at housing code violations and concentrating efforts in areas where the threat of prosecution is more likely to convince property owners to act. Project 5000 was a project that was trying to get vacant and abandoned properties back into productive use through a tax sale foreclosure process of getting people into those structures that were going to then occupy them and potentially rehabilitate them. Project Scope was a collaboration between the city and private real estate companies to list city-owned properties to a wider market. And then Hope 6 was a HUD program that started in the 90s through HUD. And the idea was to lessen poverty concentrations in housing projects and to improve living conditions and construct sustainable neighborhoods. And so that's been ongoing through that time. There's a well-known older case study done by HUD about the Riverdale housing project that dealt with some of that Hope 6 project. Specific targeted plan in West Baltimore, where there's the highest number of abandoned and vacant housing in the city. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the more modern incarnation of some of that West Side initiative. And then the Uplands project to redevelop 91-acre apartment site from HUD and create over 1,000 new housing units. So the conclusion that the thesis came up with is that, again, neighborhoods with the majority population of minorities are simultaneously below the median household income and have higher instances of vacant and abandoned housing, Baltimore-wide. Much of those vacant and abandoned parcels have been replaced with housing that's geared toward higher income households. So this gentrification problem, some of the programs I mentioned in those conclusions were really focused on people who could afford to then make modifications and rehab those homes. Vacant and abandoned housing definitely is an indicator of other societal problems like crime, population loss, and job loss. And then this just looked at, a few recommendations about how the city of Baltimore might address their problem. I'm not going to talk through each of these individually because I think it's more interesting to think about a question that I can pose to you, and it relates to looking at these sort of four aspects of a blight elimination and abandoned property management strategy. Starting with blight prevention. So, tools to use that don't even allow structures to become blighted in the first place, looking at targeted acquisition and disposition programs, and then redevelopment incentives. There's tools on the books that address various tools that touch in various of these four program areas. But what if we could get an integrated market-driven solution? What might that look like? And so I want to close on a video staying in Baltimore on what that integrated market-driven solution might look like. And I'm going to caveat it by saying that, unfortunately, the program as it's described in the video through COVID has changed. So it's not quite the same as the video shows it, but the elements of the program are still in place, and what the work that was accomplished. Well, maybe I won't show you that video. That's odd. That worked earlier, but it's not working now. All right, well, what we'll do is when we follow up with everybody, I will send a link that works to that video. It's about the Baltimore Urban Wood project. It's pretty interesting. Oh, maybe it's gonna go now. All right, let's try it. We still okay, Harmony, if I let this go?
Yeah, please.
All right.
I think that when a lot of people think Baltimore, they think of a lot of the problems first and foremost. Baltimore does have at least 16,000 houses that are identified as vacant and probably another 24,000 that are assumed vacant.
Typically, a lot of the vacant and abandoned buildings in Baltimore would be demolished.
We have premium materials that are largely being wasted because there's no supply chain set up to turn it into something of greater value.
An alternative is deconstruction, so taking apart the house piece by piece. So rather than carting those materials to the landfill, they can be reused again. Fundamentally, the Urban Wood Project began as a quest to reclaim urban wood, and it very quickly became so much more.
There's still a demand for reclaimed materials, and people do love the provenance, the story. They love knowing that not only did these bricks and then this wood come out of houses that were built by Baltimore City residents, but now they're being taken down by Baltimore City residents that were coming out of incarceration, who were previously cut out of the workforce and now have a pathway back in. And the social impact that this harvesting of urban wood is creating adds to that story tenfold.
It occurred to me that what we really need to do is connect up with a national retailer and start to build the case for supply and demand on a national scale. We called up Room and Board, and they were immediately captivated and interested by the story and wanted to join in the partnership.
Being part of a project that's really generating a lot of great benefits in an area of need with people who are really in need has been very fulfilling. Customers can see the beauty in the pieces, and they know that there's this added benefit that their decision is actually fueling change socially and environmentally.
When an entire block of row homes comes down, there's an opportunity for neighborhoods to be renewed and refreshed. We try to create and enhance our urban tree canopy cover because we recognize that it has incredible benefits for the people who live in the built environment, for the biodiversity, for our own mental and physical health and well-being. It's really about enabling large-scale change, providing economic opportunity for those who may lack it, transforming neighborhoods from places that have a lot of blight and despair on the landscape to communities that have a reason for hope.
We do believe the Urban Wood Project is replicable in other cities, especially the post-industrial cities.
From Tulsa, Oklahoma to St. Louis to Philadelphia to Chicago, and we're increasingly finding that a lot of cities are ready to try it.
So I'll just close on some of the things that would be covered in my class that's offered as part of the graduate certificate program, Advanced Dome Ecology, Sustainable Built Environment. Just a note that this notion of dome ecology is an idea that originated at MSU. There was a group of about 3 or 4 researchers that have worked together on this idea that we need to think about the life cycle of the built environment at the time that we construct it, not at the time that we need to get the built environment or aspects of the built environment off of the landscape. So in addition to some of the things I just touched on briefly today, we'll also look at strategies for prevention of abandonment and blight, current policies and practice related to managing abandonment and blight, and then really getting into some of the technical aspects of looking at demolition and deconstruction, analyzing some of the financial, economic, and social impacts of those methods and what they provide versus where one method might be more suitable at times than another method. We'll look at some global efforts to develop circular economies for salvage building materials and look at what we can learn from some of those global efforts and apply here in the US. And then students will have the opportunity to work within their own community to identify and analyze a key dome ecology related problem. So some problem related to the life cycle of the built environment. And the key part of that project is that students will have an opportunity to work with people within their own community to start to build a plan to address that challenge that they're facing. So thank you for your time. And I think I'll be passing it off to Wayne at this point.
Yes, thank you, George. And now I invite Wayne.
Great, thank you. Thank you, George and Noah and Harmony for kind of setting the stage for us this afternoon. I can go on to the next slide, Harmony. One of the things we've heard a lot of comments here today and discussion about some of the causes of the lack of affordable housing and some of the key challenges. And in many respects, it's the perfect storm, so to speak, with both the economic issues, the natural environment issues taking place, and also some of the equity issues that we've been talking about. But just for the sake of discussion here, so that we're all on the same page, this idea of resiliency that we hear so much about, and resilience, resilient housing market or resilient redevelopment, just some terminology so that we're on the same page. When we talk about resiliency, we're really talking about, at least from the institutional city perspective, communities that can not only survive and adapt, but that they can grow no matter what kinds of chronic stresses and acute shocks that they are under. This could be natural disasters that take place. It could be some of the economic issues that we've seen. It could be some of the technological issues, such as the Flint water crisis, which were more human-made than anything else. And then when we talk about redevelopment opportunities, because this is a key component in housing and meeting our current housing stock, whether we talk about Baltimore or Flint, or the examples that Noah and George gave, there's opportunities not only for some of the deficient and blighted areas, but also those areas that have become obsolete or inappropriately used. So what sometimes we refer to these as gray fields, or areas where there's opportunity for redevelopment as well. One of the key issues when you think about it, how this all works together. I mean, this is truly what's been referred to as a wicked problem, right? There's not one solution for one problem. It's really cyclical in many respects, and how we've seen through the examples here today and our own observations how these really play out, and really you need to address this from all the above solutions rather than trying to hone in just on one specific opportunity. When we talk about confronting issues of resiliency, one of the key components here that's been an issue in moving forward, and certainly George was alluding to this with some of the challenges in moving forward. We have not only some of the economic issues that are taking place, we have some of the natural issues, whether it's climate change or some of the hazard risks that are taking place, whether you live where we do, what's referred to as the North Coast in the Great Lakes region, East Coast, West Coast, Gulf states, all areas of the country, inland, are experiencing some of the same issues and challenges. And this is putting further stress on the housing markets, and does present some opportunities on the redevelopment side. So really, one opportunity is to both take the concepts of resiliency, working with some of the issues that Noah had addressed and George had addressed, and when we have opportunities for redevelopment, working them together so that communities are truly not only just in the survival mode, but moving towards adaptation and actually growth that is going to be sustainable. So couple of things, and George was talking about some of the legislation and the legal tools that are out there. So certainly, and one of the concepts that George mentioned was land banking. If you don't have that in your particular state, Michigan is one of the leaders on that. Most states have some form of land bank authorities which deal with underutilized, vacant, and foreclosed properties, and try to work towards getting those into productive use again. So there's clearly the legislative part that local communities alone cannot do, that really need to be in partnership with regional organizations and statewide organizations and the state legislature. There's programs that are out there. One example that's mentioned here is the Michigan Economic Development Corporation's Redevelopment Ready Communities, which is really kind of a voluntary certification process for local units of government, so that they are actually ready for redevelopment and actually can work through public-private partnerships to address some of the housing issues and redevelopment opportunities. It's both a training program and a certification program, both for local officials and for the communities, that opens up some grant dollars. And also there's important best practices out there. There's a big initiative that has taken place in Michigan and other places called placemaking. There was a major funded initiative called the My Place Initiative. You can look that up. There's some great resources that are out there at both at the MSU and extension websites, but in other locations, which really talk about some of the policies that we've described here and how you can integrate that into local planning and development. And then the other component layer that we've all been faced with, particularly in recent history, has been more of climate and health adaptation. How do we address not only the issue of affordable housing, but sustainable and resilient housing with addressing climate and health? One of the key resources that have been out there is a new climate and health adaptation planning guide that actually can be found at Michigan State University, which really drew on best practices and research from around the country. Noah talked about the missing middle, and I would really encourage everyone who's on the Zoom call here today to take a close look at your community's zoning and policy regulations to see to what extent this middle housing is or is not addressed. And it not only is from the affordability aspect in clear dollars and cents, but it also comes down to a sustainability component as well. When Noah was talking about sprawl and growth, if we just have large lot, single family, detached development, that doesn't usually get us the type of community that many are trying to seek. Nor just building the mid-rise, high-rise opportunities. So really, I think the challenge is to be able to have that mix of housing that is both sustainably built and is equitable to a variety of those within the region, so that they can afford based on some of the principles that Harmony was discussing. Next slide. So just a few key issues to consider. We talked about some of the laws and regulations that are out there that need to be addressed. There's a lot of attention to greenhouse gas emissions, and sometimes the focus seems to be all on cars oftentimes, but we know that about 30% of greenhouse gas emissions come from building and building practices. And so the built environment plays a key role in this. And it not only is something that addresses the environmental aspects, but then also can begin to address the affordability aspects in moving forward. Next slide. One of the ways that this was approached locally, just as a case study example, up in Marquette, Michigan, in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, the largest county, actually, Marquette County in the state, one of the largest counties in the Midwest. We had a partnership with funding from the Centers for Disease Control and Michigan Department of Health and Human Services to really take a look at countywide in smaller communities, because a lot of the emphasis has been on large cities, and the literature and information about practices for small and medium-sized communities has been less extensive. So we wanted to really take a look at more of a rural county to be able to see how some of these issues could be addressed. So through a multi-year type of project, there was an extensive stakeholder input and engagement and visualization aspects. So actually the residents could see, when we talk about these obscure aspects or terminology of resiliency, what does it actually look like? And so that was part of the volume one. The volume two, where we really got into the policy and some of the metrics. So how do we measure this going forward? How do we update our zoning ordinances and master plan and policy guides moving forward? And then finally, how do we prioritize this and moving forward? So I'd encourage you to take a look at this guide as at least one way that communities can begin to approach and address and measure some of the success in moving forward. Next slide. So in partnership with our urban planning and landscape architecture program here at the School of Planning, Design, and Construction at MSU, we took a lot of pictures throughout the county, and we asked residents to identify, all right, how might we have some resilient redevelopment mixed use opportunities? So this is a before picture of a site across from a Target and a newer roundabout, but more of a vacant, underutilized site. And next picture, next slide. and how you can provide some infill development, not only to address some of the placemaking goals that the community had established, but also some of the green development opportunities, whether it's green roofs, solar panels, some of the pervious pavement, bike sharing, mixed use development, walkability, a number of components that could be built in that study after study has shown that there's strong interest, and few communities are providing the market solution to a variety of housing that can really truly meet all the market demand in this segment. Next slide. So one tool that's been out there actually for a while now, 20 about coming up on 20 years here, is called LEED ND, Leadership Through Energy and Environmental Design, and ND stands for Neighborhood Development. So many of you have probably seen some of the LEED basically plaques that are on some of the newer or adaptive reuse buildings, but the concept has also been applied to neighborhoods. So it's one thing to have a green building, but a green building that's out on its own and not accessible and walkable to isn't really long-term sustainable. So the idea of having policies and procedures in place for how you can have neighborhood development that meets both the environmental and energy goals is key. And what's important here, I think, is for communities to look at the LEED ND standards that are out there and to be able to see how are our policies and our ordinance structured to be able to incentivize one of the things that George was focusing on. How do we incentivize developers and property owners to move forward with some of this resilient redevelopment? And a number of different organizations move together, but certainly, as Noah was talking about, smart growth is really key. We need to contain our sprawl, but the form of that development is also important, and how we're building our structures need to get attention. So all three really need to come together: the smart growth, new urbanism, green buildings, to be able to improve that quality of life for resilient redevelopment and housing. We've talked a lot about some of the regulatory tools. Noah spent a good deal of time talking about zoning in particular. Some states have been proactive in moving forward, specifically with policies that promote renewable energy. Most states have a renewable portfolio standard at this point in time. Others have been earlier adopters on this to look forward. So just a couple of examples. I think in New York that they have use by right for solar panels on roofs. Some communities now in Michigan and others are making that more accessible to be able to do. And Huntington, New York, which basically gave expedited review for some of the renewable energy systems and reduced or eliminated permit fees for some of these types of projects. These are some of the things that can be done by communities to address the resiliency question and opportunity. Next slide. One extensive study over multiple years that was done by our School of Planning, Design, and Construction and MSU Extension in partnership with the University of Michigan was to actually take a look at zoning ordinances throughout the state of Michigan to see how are communities currently regulating renewable energy. What are some of the incentives or barriers that they're putting forward? And that was an extensive look at literally hundreds of zoning ordinances in moving forward. One way to address this through zoning and regulatory techniques that's been identified, or I should say not one way, but multiple ways that these could be addressed are in this planning and zoning guide. I would encourage you to take a look at this. It's a free download, which really highlights both the procedure and some of the opportunities for moving forward. So certainly zoning has been under a lot of scrutiny lately. And one of the slides that Noah highlighted was the American Planning Association and their zoning reform initiative that's taking place right now to address affordable housing. I can tell you I was at the American Planning Association National Planning Conference last week in San Diego, And the number one issue was affordable housing. For the 3,000 plus planners that were there, all the sessions on affordable housing were overflowing. And so this is a wicked problem hitting all regions of the country right now. So, but there are some things that can be done locally that are within our control. We'll focus on a few here. And I don't think any one of these is the silver bullet, so to speak. It's really going to take a number of different approaches in moving forward. But there's certainly the focus on building envelope and lot sizes. Noah mentioned a few examples of that. This middle housing that we've really honed in on here about what are we providing? You know, do we need to have more than the 3 flavors of ice cream? You know, vanilla, chocolate, and strawberry. You need to have the Baskin Robbins approach to this, where there's multiple opportunity and housing options within your community. Form-based code, again, could be one of the opportunities that communities are experimenting with now in Michigan and elsewhere. We don't have time to get into detail on form-based code, but just as the name applies, it focuses less on uses and more on the form and structure. And so as a way that can be built in. Some of those mixed use zones so that it's clearly allowing for commercial and residential and different housing styles on the same lot and development, whether that's done through planned unit development or conditional rezoning or some other contract zoning technique in Michigan or elsewhere. Those are all key. And then, you know, some of the off-street parking requirements. Oftentimes communities have minimum requirements. Why not the maximum requirement, so that you're not overbuilding the paving and also increasing some of the construction costs. Noah gave a lot of examples about accessory dwelling units, and there's been a lot of attention that's been given on basically to that particular topic. I will caution you though that that's only one of the tools to be able to look at. As a matter of fact, in Oregon, some of you might be familiar, they recently passed statewide legislation that mandates, in most instances, accessory dwelling units to be allowed in every community in single family district. And so again, there's few exceptions that are out there to that, but they've taken this on in a big way, and many states and localities are doing this. But some of the research is mixed right now in terms of whether that alone can solve some of the housing crisis. Nonetheless, it is one of the tools in the toolkit. And again, we could have a whole session on short-term rentals, but there's a lot of examples from around the country where a lack of regulation on short-term rentals has increased housing costs because owners from outside the community are bidding on some of the homes and increasing the prices and not allowing the housing for workforce housing to become available in the community for those that are living and working in the community. So this is kind of a hit list of some of the components, and this is highlighted further in some of the MSU extension training programs on affordable or attainable housing. So the goal and benefit of sustainable design and affordability. First of all, I think let's be clear here. In many instances, you're going to be increasing your costs initially up front for some of these, not in all instances, but in some instances. So you might hear the argument, well, this all costs money and who's going to pay for it? Well, on the back end, there's the opportunity to reduce the cost for some of the utility, water use, and so forth. So there is an opportunity to think about this both short-term and long-term. Next slide. So a couple of the key things here, if you do move forward with some of the sustainable housing components, there is the opportunities for some of the tenants to spend less on utilities if you're using some of these resiliency and sustainability techniques, operators to reduce their long-term costs, and some of the green construction is going to address some of the other goals that the community has forward. So it can really be a kind of a triple bottom line winner if it's done well. There's some good resources that are out there. One example, the Sustainable Housing for Sustainable Cities guide is just one example on how to move forward with some of these recommendations. Next slide. And finally, as my colleagues have done, I just wanted to leave with the Planning, Design, and Construction, or PDC 878. It's also part of this Urban Resilient Redevelopment Certificate Program. And in this course that I teach, not only will you learn some of the concepts that we've covered here today, but really focusing on more of the practice-oriented components. So if you are a real estate developer and planner, and you want to integrate and some of the planning and zoning aspects for resilient redevelopment into your daily practice, how do you do that? So we look at some of the state and local policies and best practices for moving forward with that. So with that, I will turn it back over to Harmony and to move forward.
Thank you, Wayne. And now I invite Joseph Mcguire.
Thank you, Harmony, and thank you everyone for being here today. I am Joe Mcguire. I am an adjunct professor at the School of Planning, Design, and Construction and the coordinator of our new graduate certificate program. I also serve as CEO of Wolverine Development Corporation in Michigan. And I tell you, coming from the industry to the faculty at School of Planning, Design, and Construction, I think you've seen a great example just now of how impressed I have always been by the faculty and the national level of expertise that our faculty possess. And one of the terrific things, new things we're doing is to bring that nationally recognized faculty to broaden their exposure to the industry through the creation of this graduate certificate program, which begins this month. Years in the planning, and you have essentially, in hearing from Wayne and George and Noah and their brief description of the courses they teach, each of those courses comprises 1/3 of, and in total, they represent our new urban resilient redevelopment graduate certificate program. That is one of 2 graduate certificates that we will be offering. So again, this is a program that begins this month. There's still time to look into this and sign up. It is a way for you to advance your career in the built environment through one of 2 avenues: urban resilient redevelopment, as we've discussed today, also real estate development and construction. I should point out there is some commonality with the 2 in the form of Noah's course, which he spoke to today on land use planning and housing. That course is contained in both of the certificate programs. As mentioned, these are taught by regular faculty at Michigan State School of Planning, Design, and Construction. They range from 8 to 12 months in duration, completed online and on your schedule. And the credits, I should add, will be applied first to a graduate certificate. At the culmination of your completion of 9 credits, you will be considered a graduate of Michigan State University and have a graduate certificate. You may choose to take those credits if the programs really interest you and apply them to one of 2 programs, our master's programs in Master of Science in Construction Management or our Master's of Urban and Regional Planning. Next slide, please. So turning first to the real estate development and construction, essentially the value proposition is provide very cost-effective, again, world-class education and credential for current and aspiring real estate professionals to further their current discipline or perhaps a transition to development and construction. We have I'll go next to, yes, so this is a infographic that deals specifically with REDC, Real Estate Development and Construction. It begins, actually my apologies, these are the how it needs to be updated. We're actually beginning this summer with land use, planning, and housing. The fall will have construction management and real estate case studies, and then we'll have real estate finance and commercial development. These credits may also be applied towards MS in construction management. And again, all these courses are graduate level. Next slide, please. The 3 courses contained in the REDC program include Noah's course, Professor Durst's course on land use planning and housing, which he addressed earlier in the presentation. I will also be teaching a course on real estate finance and commercial development, and joining Professor Matt Seil in teaching construction management and real estate case studies. Okay, next slide, please. Now, returning to urban resilient redevelopment, which we spoke about during today's webinar, essentially the same overall concept, but in terms of the benefits, but the focus being, of course, on planning urban redevelopment with a focus on resiliency, as my colleagues have spoken to today. Next one, please, Harmony. So this, again, how does show the proper timeline here. This actually begins with both summer semesters and continues through the fall. So this will begin this month and run all the way through December. The credits earned here will not only go towards the graduate certificate in urban resilient redevelopment, but can be applied as well to a master's of urban and regional planning. Next, please. You have just heard from all three instructors for the Urban Resilient Redevelopment Certificate, and they have outlined briefly the courses which are contained there. Next, please. Briefly, as opposed to both, as applies to both of the certificate programs, this is completely online and it's an asynchronous modality, so that this is designed for the working professional. Courses may be taken, need be taken online and at your own schedule. There's no schedule per se. They will be rolled out on a regular basis, but can be taken at your convenience. And again, the credit hours are recorded on your Michigan State transcript and may be applied towards requirements. I mentioned a couple of master's degrees programs for which we can tell you they will be applicable, but it's possible they would be applicable to master's programs throughout the university and perhaps beyond as well. Next, please. As to admissions requirement, simply a bachelor's degree from an accredited institution, or we do admit current MSU undergraduate students. We ask for a personal statement of your career goals and objectives. And as per the university requirements, we require 3 letters of recommendation along with your submission of your application. Next, please. So this gives you contact information. If you look reading from left to right, this presents first the Urban Resilient Redevelopment Graduate Certificate, your URR. You have a QR code or a web address you can go to. In the middle column features a Real Estate Development and Construction Graduate Certificate, same means of communication. And finally, just for a broader look at the entire graduate certificate program, there's your QR code and web address. So we're very pleased that we had such a good turnout today and that so many of you have been able to join us. We hope you find this interesting and that you might consider, if it does interest you, how further study and a credential from Michigan State University School of Planning, Design, and Construction might enhance your own personal interest and enhance your career development. And with that, I will turn it back to Harmony.
Thank you, Joe. Really, it's an exciting new opportunity, and the topics are very timely. Really happy to see this certificate program coming along. So thank you, Joe, George, Noah, Wayne, and also thank Wesley here on the call and Maggie for their assistance in the background. I also want to bookend this event with just a quick mention of MSU Extension's housing programs, non-certificate programs, I might add, but several other offerings coming up this summer and fall in a wide range of settings, from a quick 1-hour webinar to the more 90-minute intensive about exclusive to inclusive single family zoning and building a foundation for attainable housing. I will throw a quick link into the chat for everyone if you want more information on that from Extension. With that, we had a couple of questions that came in and they've since been answered, but we do invite all of you to put your questions into the chat or Q&A. We had a question earlier about, let's see here. changing the square footage minimum requirements in the zoning of 1,000 square foot for any new home. That's their minimum square foot requirement for any new home. And they have not dabbled in the tiny homes concept of yet. And what would be the opinion of a tiny home concept? Is it a decent concept for offering more affordable or attainable housing? I believe, Noah, you had answered that, let's see here, was depends on the community, of course, what you had said, and accessory dwelling unit ordinances are even more promising for many communities. They're taking advantage of the existing land in the low density residential areas. But in either case, a reduction in the minimum size square footages in the zoning ordinance is worth considering. So thank you. And Bob, you had added a little bit more on that. We can see in the Q&A. In most zoning ordinances, tiny homes tend to fall under the mobile home or manufactured home land use category. So in recommending accessory dwelling units and the removal of minimal sizes is a process of making tiny homes and other housing types more widely possible. So yes, excellent tool for building up a range of attainable and affordable housing. And to also, though, Bob has helped out and states that to take a look at public health guidelines. Minimum square footage per resident is recommended at 150 square foot for the first resident and 100 square foot for each additional resident. So keep those public health recommendations in mind, and also building codes we have found to be something to always keep in mind when it comes to tiny homes. Well, let's see, we had another question that came in the chat about mitigating hazardous materials, about lead and asbestos, and it was for George, for Dr. Berghorn. And what do you do about lead paint in these buildings that are being deconstructed and reused? And Bob, you had said, and thank you for that, does require full abatement to be collected, stored, and resold, cleaning, and testing. So good question and helpful answer on that. That is in the chat. Do you have anything else? Yeah, I don't see anything else. Let's see. We had a question. Could you please copy and paste a link to the admission requirements for the certificate program? We'll do that. Thank you.
Doing that right now. I just did that, Harmony.
Excellent. Appreciate it. All right. I don't see other questions coming in. Does anyone have any final thoughts from the panel before we sign off in a few?
I'm just going to, I would add, Harmony, that I'm adding for the benefit of the questioner, all three different websites for the graduate certificate program, and then for each of the two certificate programs.
Great. Thanks for adding those in there.
Sorry, I'm having.
So Wayne, we might have a question for you on your resiliency work. What are our thoughts on solar efforts in Michigan right now as far as the payoff and what we've been seeing? What are the trends?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think as the question would imply, sometimes it's not been paying off. It depends on who you're talking about. And I think between the conversations that we had from all the panelists, that I think weighing the cost to the developer, the way to the actual homeowner that's going to benefit from some of these, and the community in terms of some of its green policies. I think how we measure costs on some of these, and the externalities of either not doing them or some of the policies, I think need to get played in. But I'd welcome George or Noah to weigh in on that as well, particularly as it relates to renewable energy in some of our green buildings. But I think that's why one of my slides I indicated that there is a premium cost up front, at least from some of the research, right? And the opportunities to get that on the back end, make that up on the back end.
It's a long-term payoff as far as paying off, right? Long-term. I've heard that it takes a typical home, if you're talking about individual solar panels, about 12 years to see a payoff in the investment you put into individual solar panels for a home. And so I'm not exactly sure what the payoff range or schedule is for the larger, large scale principal use solar. We are having a series of workshops starting in May and bus tours throughout June and July, and more workshops about solar and regulating solar, and those questions would definitely be answered. So again, visit the MSU Extension website, search for solar regulation workshops, and we do have webinars and in-person events starting this month.
There's one new comment in the chat, Harmony.
All right, let's see. Pertains to infill residential development ordinances. Well, thank you, Najma. And Najma, we want to acknowledge your work and your partnership with the MSU and Extension in the past. Nice, good to see you. I'm glad to see that you're working on that project, become a model for us to learn from. Getting a lot of thank yous in the chat. And we appreciate that. We appreciate the kudos. And as a follow-up, you will receive a recording of this presentation, a copy of the slide deck, and all of the links that we have shared here today. And most importantly, for our benefit, a evaluation link will be included. Please, we really appreciate your time filling out an evaluation. It does help us improve our events in the future. So with that, it looks like we've come to the end of our time together. Certainly appreciate everyone's time. Enjoy the weather out there. It's beautiful, and good luck with all of your work related to housing, and don't be a stranger. We look forward to seeing you as part of the certificate program and the other MSU and Extension events. So have a good afternoon, everyone. Thank you.